Welcome to The Explainer. So if you're the kind of person who loves digging into the actual structural DNA of a nation's laws and seeing how they adapt over time, well, you are definitely in the right place. Today, we're zooming in on an absolutely foundational pillar of the Indian Constitution. I'm talking about Article 16. Literally, since the Constitution was adopted back on January 26, 1950, this one specific article has been a massive cornerstone of fundamental rights. So we're going to trace its evolution and unpack exactly how this core promise of equality has been tweaked, refined, and expanded over the decades. Buckle up, because we're about to map out a seriously fascinating journey through constitutional history.
Okay, let's dive right into this. The baseline promise here, like the absolute core of Article 16, is actually deceptively simple. It basically guarantees equality of opportunity in matters of public employment for all citizens. What does that mean? It means when the state is hiring, everyone gets a fair shot, period. No discrimination, just pure equal opportunity. This was the bedrock principle laid down in 1950, setting a really high standard for a newly independent nation. But as we all know, taking a grand principle like equality and applying it across a massive, incredibly diverse society, that requires some continuous fine-tuning.
Which brings us to a pretty mind-blowing number. 5. Think about it. Despite all the massive societal shifts, the crazy economic transformations, and all the political changes in India over the last 70-plus years, this fundamental guarantee of workplace equality, it's only been amended 5 times since 1950? That is a strikingly low number, right? Especially when you consider how much the country itself has evolved. What this tells us is that while the core promise is incredibly sturdy, the framework around it has been very selectively and very carefully upgraded only when absolutely necessary to fix real-world's complex challenges.
So here's our quick roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with Section 1, the promise of Article 16. Then, Section 2, adapting to new borders. Section 3 covers advancing SC and ST promotions. Section 4 is solving the backlog dilemma. Section 5 tackles the economic weaker sections, and we'll wrap up with Section 6, an evolving constitutional right.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the promise of Article 16, a timeline of change.
Before we get bogged down in the nitty-gritty details of parliamentary acts, it really helps to just zoom out for a bird's-eye view. We kind of need to feel the rhythm of these changes to truly appreciate them. Notice the massive gap in the dates. The very first tweak happens in 1956, pretty soon after the Constitution went live. But then, nothing. There's this super long stretch of quiet until 1995. And that kicks off a rapid-fire succession of updates in 2000 and 2001. Finally, we jump all the way to the modern era in 2019. Now, what's absolutely crucial to grasp here is the logical flow of this history. It's not random. It shifts dramatically from an early administrative tweak in the 50s straight into a heavy cluster of deep social reforms around the turn of the millennium, and then pivots toward economic reforms in the present day.
Moving right along to Section 2, adapting to new borders, the 7th Amendment. To really get this one, we have to mentally anchor ourselves in early independent India. The reorganization of states and the creation of union territories meant that the literal physical borders of India's internal map were actively being redrawn, so naturally the laws had to catch up and reflect that new reality. And this brilliantly illustrates how the 7th Constitutional Amendment Act stepped in. It modified Article 16.3 purely to update the language regarding parliamentary laws on residence requirements for employment. It wasn't some huge philosophical shift, it was an essential, purely administrative update, basically ensuring that when the state hired people, its rulebook actually matched the newly reorganized geography of the nation.
All right, Section 3, Advancing SC and ST Promotions, the 1995 and 2001 updates.
So fast forward almost 40 years, and the pace of constitutional change really starts to accelerate. The focus here shifts away from geographic administration and moves firmly toward ensuring social equity and representation at all levels of government service. We're looking at a direct cause-and-effect relationship between two pivotal amendments here. First up, the 77th Amendment Act in 1995. This was a massive structural addition. It inserted a brand new clause, Article 16.4a, which allowed the state to make specific provisions for reservation in promotions. So not just initial hiring anymore, but the actual promotions for scheduled castes, or SCs, and scheduled tribes, STs, in government jobs. But the legal evolution didn't stop there. Just a few years later, the 85th Amendment Act in 2001 built directly upon that exact same clause. It modified Article 16.4a to include a legal concept called consequential seniority for those SC and ST government employees who are promoted under the quotas. And here's a totally fascinating legal twist. This 2001 update was designed to have a retrospective impact. That means it applied backward. all the way to June 17, 1995, basically hot-wiring it to sync up perfectly with the original timing and intent of the 77th Amendment.
Next up, Section 4, Solving the Backlog Dilemma, the 81st Amendment.
Now, what's really interesting is that right in between those two updates we just talked about, in the year 2000, lawmakers hit a serious wall. They had to solve a really complex mathematical and administrative headache. See, the number 50% was a strict, hard ceiling cap when it came to constitutional reservations in India. The rule was total annual reservations could not exceed 50% of the vacancies in any given year. But think about the logistics. What happens if the state tries to fill those reserved seats but literally can't find enough eligible candidates that specific year? Well, those seats stay empty, and that creates a backlog. The math problem here was that if the state tried to roll those unfilled vacancies over to the next year, adding them to the New Year's quota would blow right past that 50% ceiling cap. It was a complete mathematical deadlock.
So how on earth do you solve a constitutional math problem? Well, you use a highly precise constitutional amendment, of course. In 2000, the 81st Constitutional Amendment Act swooped in and introduced yet another new clause, Article 16(4)(b). This explicitly allowed the state to take those unfilled reserved vacancies from a previous year, the backlog we just talked about, and treat them as a completely separate class of vacancies. By categorizing them differently, the law made it so these backlog vacancies would bypass and not be counted toward that strict 50% ceiling cap on total annual reservations. It was a perfectly targeted mechanical fix just to ensure past opportunities wouldn't be wiped out because of a current year's limit.
Which brings us to Section 5, the economic weaker sections, the 103rd Amendment.
Jumping all the way to the modern era in 2019, the definition of who exactly requires assistance in public employment expanded once again. The 103rd Amendment Act inserted Article 16(6). Now, it kept all the existing reservations we've been talking about fully intact, but it introduced a newly defined quota of up to 10% specifically designated for economically weaker sections, or EWS, of citizens. The absolutely crucial thing to note here is the wording. This 10% reservation in public employment is provided over and above the existing reservations. It explicitly carved out a distinct, separate layer of opportunity that focused strictly on economic vulnerability, rather than historical social categories.
And finally, Section 6, an evolving constitutional right.
Okay, let's just take a breath, slow down for a second, and synthesize everything we've just absorbed. We have literally witnessed 70 years of evolution. We started way back in 1956 with a constitution that was really just updating its language to match new administrative boundaries on a map. Then we moved through the 90s and early 2000s, where the lens shifted sharply towards social empowerment, ensuring fair representation and promotions, and untangling those complex vacancy backlogs. And finally, we arrived in 2019, broadening the scope even further to encompass economic inclusion. So, why does all this matter? What is the main thing you should take away from this explainer today? It's the definitive proof that a constitution is not just some static, dusty relic. It is a living, breathing document. Article 16 shows us exactly how constitutional mechanics adapt, bend, and evolve to meet the ever-changing needs, complexities, and realities of the people it actually governs.
So, I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought to ponder. We've seen equality defined by geographic boundaries, by historical social disadvantages, and by present-day economic status. As our society inevitably continues to shift and evolve, how will our definition of equality evolve next? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.